And welcome, everybody. It is Friday. Welcome. It is, wow, halfway through October already, October 15th. Craziness. So welcome to the Food Safety Chat Live. This is a live stream that takes place every Friday. And we do this at 8 a.m. Mountain, 10 a.m. Eastern here in the United States. And we live stream on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube. And if you're new to the platform, thank you very much for joining us. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But this is a unique thing that's kind of out there. We've all been to webinars and things like this where a presenter and expert talks and we ask some questions and things like this. This is interactive. And what I do on this platform is I bring in leading food safety experts from around the world to come in and talk with you about food safety. And today we have an amazing guest, and we'll get to that in just a minute. But first off, one of the things that we like to do here is, I'm always amazed by this, Omar, is everybody please let us know where in the world you're joining us from. So I am in Loveland, Colorado in the US, which is about an hour north of the Denver metro area. And we're getting snow in the mountains up here, Omar. I think they were saying 12 inches of snow is coming. So winter is on the way.
It's coming.
and you're in Burlington, Vermont, right?
Correct. And winter is coming soon too, although we have had beautiful days still. Yeah.
Let's see, what is the current temperature here at 8 o'clock? 0 C. We are at
zero.
Wow. Yes. So luckily I have drained my sprinklers from the surface level. So that's one of the problems out here is you need to worry about that in the fall, that you don't freeze that system, which is always crazy. So are the leaves and things like that in Vermont, are they changing and all the
they're changing? Yes, there is quite a bit of green this year for some reason, and people are kind of taking off because you say it doesn't look good, with all this green still. But today is a sunny day and it's 66 Fahrenheit here, so yeah.
So I think you're going to have a warmer day than we are.
Yes, for sure. Yeah.
Good morning, Corey. Always great to see your face here. Thank you for joining us. So one of these things, and I was trying, and so one of the things that we do when we get ready for the food safety chat is all like little notes on Post-its that I use then for the conversation and trying to then put together an introduction for the guests. And I have a Post-it here that is completely full of all of the credentials and things that our guest here today has done. Oh, wow. Najeri, welcome. Botswana. Wow. How cool is that? Austin, of course. Good morning, Austin. Always great to see you, my friend. But Dr. Omar Oyarzabal, Argentinian in descent, joins us today. And he is also, like me, a fellow consultant at EAS. And so we go out and help people within the food space and things like this. And Omar owns his company, Food Safety Team, which is based in Burlington, Vermont. And he has a long laundry list of accomplishments. So he has a PhD. He's a veterinarian. You've written a couple of books too, right?
Yeah, we co-edited a couple of books about food microbiology and safety.
And that's really cool. And one of the things that we wanted to talk today about is some really interesting activities around food safety that people really don't hear a whole lot about. And that's acidified foods, low acid canned foods, special processing that needs to happen with those type of things. And it's a highly technical area. And it's interesting how this kind of overlays with food safety that we're used to now with FSMA and how this came from HACCP and really how HACCP and a lot of different things came from low acid canned food. So there's been a long history of the regulations in this area.
Right, that's correct. Yeah, it goes back to the 70s. Mm-hmm. The regulations were, implemented at the end of the 70s. We still have, I guess, one issue of Clostridium botulinum in a commercially sold can back in 1982.
Oh, really?
I think that was the last one that we are aware of. In large number, but remember there are sometimes sporadic cases when people start making product and they're not aware, especially small amounts, small companies that are trying to make new products.
Exactly. So good morning, Bryan, and good morning, Dawn. Nice to see you guys as well. So one of the things, Omar, that I am super guilty at is every time we have our food safety chats is I want to get into the topics right away. And I forget the one important thing that we all need to start our mornings with, and that is joining us for a sip of coffee or tea or your favorite beverage. So everybody, let's all join in together.
There we are.
Wonderful. I like your cup, by the way. That's a cool cup.
Yeah, it's I don't know, simple cup.
Those are the best ones, right? Because if you break it, you're like, okay.
Yeah, I am a little bit infamous with glassware around me, and ceramic.
Exactly. I mean, so let's so I'm sure a lot of people really don't understand these regulations. I know for me, I know enough to be dangerous, but nowhere near what you know. And a lot of times when we were kids growing up, Omar, we were told, right, okay, your mom would be in the grocery store and there's like dented cans that are in the discount bin. And it was like, okay, as long as the can is not bloated, you're probably going to be okay. And it kind of stopped at that point. But I think a lot of people didn't understand is why. Why was that can bloated to begin with? What caused those issues? And what's lurking underneath the skin of that can that was causing that problem?
Very interesting. I think the regulations set up some terms that were kind of unique. One of the terms that this regulation have is a commercially sterile product. So the concept of sterility, as you know from the microbiology standpoint, is very hard to achieve in food because it means nothing, right?
Yeah.
So maybe we can achieve that, but probably food may not be edible. Here we are trying to talk about what is commercially sterile, meaning that we have destroyed all of the potential hazards from public health concern, at least in the vegetative form. And if they're going to be on the spore form of the spore fashion, they're not going to be able to germinate and multiply through the storage and distribution, so through the shelf life. And also includes, that definition also includes potential spoilage organisms that again can germinate and produce spoilage. That goes back to the blooding that you're talking about. The blooding doesn't mean it's Clostridium botulinum. It can be another, environmental microorganism that has the opportunity to multiply and produce gas and produce that blooding.
So when the can gets damaged and that seal gets punctured, something could maybe get in there and start growing and get access to oxygen.
Exactly. So microorganisms can come from outside if there is not a hermetically sealed container. That's part of the regulation. The regulation for this one particular, for low acid food, is thermally processed low acid food in hermetically sealed containers, right? Or hermetically sealed. So we're talking about a container that is hermetically sealed. Now, that's one part. You prevent, microorganisms coming from the outside. But if you don't have a processing, especially temperature processing, that is adequate, it may still be surviving inside the product and can produce spoilage also.
Well, that's a good point, Omar, because I don't think a lot of people necessarily understand that. So, for example, when they say that something is pasteurized, it's not sterile, right? So with pasteurization, you're reducing the bacteria that are present, but generally, and the minimum threshold for pasteurization is a 10 to the 5th log reduction, which 10 to the 6 is a million, right? So you're talking 100,000 colonies per mil or gram of material. So if you have a high number to begin with in the raw source and you're going through and you're knocking out 100,000, but you've got a million, well, you're still going to have a problem.
Right. And the term pasteurization, beside the historical fact that Louis Pasteur was working actually with wine manufacturing, and that's how he was trying to make the wine have a better shelf life, because back in those days, the wine didn't have a good shelf life. Then we have been using that, and that term started to pick up more in the early 1900s, and it goes all historically with milk, fluid milk. And that's where pasteurization has this connotation. But, within milk, you can have different values of temperature, time, whether it's a short-term, long-term, high, if you have pressure, now that we have aseptic systems, you can create almost a low acid food like milk can be, treated to a point in which you can just leave it at room temperature. So it would it would fit within this regulation that we're talking about.
Yeah. So when I in a past life, when I worked for a beverage company, we would make those little tiny little creamer cups, right, that you see in stores, and they're sitting out on the shelf and they're at room temperature, and you put those are commercially sterile.
Exactly, commercially sterile. When people say, "Are they sterile?" Well, no, actually, you look in some food, you may find a spore that will germinate and have something. So, from the microbiology standpoint, the sterility that means zero is not there, but at least it's commercially sterile. It's safe, and at least we are also trying to prevent any spoilage microorganism from growing.
Yep, absolutely. So, Raphael, good morning, my friend. I had a comment here. You may want to learn about Kraft cheese. They first pasteurized cheese ever. Yep. That's a good point.
There you are. Yep.
And I mean, really, I mean, so Omar, this kind of goes back to this incredible time around the early 1900s, and we're starting to figure all these things out, right? And we're starting to figure out better ways to save our food, right? Because in the past you had ice and salt and things like this, and you would try and manipulate the food, but you had very, very short shelf life on this food, right? And people needed this food to survive. So they came up and they started figuring out new ways. And as we started learning, as you had mentioned with Louis Pasteur, we started figuring out ways to manipulate that environment to kill these little buggers. And what's interesting then is we started looking at refrigeration, for example. Well, then Listeria says, "Oh, this is wonderful. I like this niche. Right? Nobody competing with me here. I think I'll grow." And again, with cans, right? They started looking at cans and saying, "Okay, if we can put things in cans and heat up that can, we can kill the bacteria in that can, and then we can keep it a long time, and we can feed our soldiers in World War I, all these type of crazy things." And they started finding some unintended, just like the Listeria, right? They started finding things in those canned products that they weren't expecting.
Correct. And remember this, they were sodding with lead. Adding a little bit of lead as an extra ingredient there. That's correct. Even the history of how we evolve, and sometimes we use temperature to create a better product. One example would be how we do fermented food. Traditionally, fermented food is natural fermentation, right? Especially dairy product that become yogurt. But if you really bring yogurt to about 180 degrees Fahrenheit, that I'm trying to remember, that would be like 20 something degrees Celsius. I'm not remembering exactly the conversion.
Yeah, but probably like 40.
40. Yeah, you're right. I'm a little bit more right. Yeah, 40. I'm so off. So if you bring to that temperature, which is a high temperature, kills a lot, and you keep it for about 10 minutes, you're actually helping the product have better consistency. So people that make yogurt, when they have inconsistencies, I said, try this. Nowadays, you can do it for about 180, a little bit more or less, for 10 minutes. Then let it cool. Then add the starter, which can be another, a little bit of another yogurt. And then you have a much better consistent yogurt. So basically, temperature has been helping us with consistency, especially for protein denaturing, and also to create a safer product, right?
Yeah. And then what's very interesting, and so these laws then around acidified food and low acid canned food, right? They started seeing problems because you're taking a low acid product, right? So meaning there's not a lot of acid available in that product, and you're canning it, and then they started finding issues. So what did they find with that, Omar?
So basically, what happened is the main concerns were Clostridium botulinum. And there were some in the 60s that were associated with some cases of mishandling during the manufacturing. Then in 1971, there was one that, if you would like to present a little bit that part on the, this is taken from a newspaper, right? And you can see here, I highlighted the von Vivant voluntary recall. And that was something that triggered a little bit this issue of the agency. In this case, we're talking about the Food and Drug Administration working with the industry. At that point, it was the National Canners Association, to create, a program, a curriculum, if you will, that became the Better Process Control School. And that's what was associated also with the training for compliance with the regulations. The actual regulations actually came out, and you can stop sharing if you will now at this point. This regulation really came at the end of the 70s. The first one was for thermally processed low acid food in hermetically sealed containers for low acid food. And then within a couple of years, there was a second regulation that came, that is for acidified food. The first one, the 123, that is for low acid food, Title 21 of the Code of Federal Regulation 113, I think originally was the one, trying to remember, 128B, but then it was transferred to 113. And then acidified food came afterwards and is codified within 21 CFR 114. The difference is the acidified food allows you to bring a product, low acid food ingredients, to a finished product with a pH below 4.6, and therefore you can use less stringent heating, processing. So you can use atmospheric heating. You can use anything at atmospheric pressure. You just don't need to have those high pressure and temperature that you reach with retorts in order to treat low acid foods.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me, what was that, Boyle's Law, right? So your relationship between temperature and pressure and all these things.
And the difference is that in the low acid food, you're trying to destroy the spores of Clostridium botulinum. Once the finished product pH is below 4.6, we know that the spores will not germinate. So you're really just destroying vegetative cells.
Gotcha. So what are some examples of what's an acidified food? What would be something we would buy?
Well, there are many things that can be acidified food. Anytime you have a product, an ingredient that is low acid food, that is mixed with acid ingredients, but the finished product is below 4.6, that would be the definition. Remember that for the agency, water is a low acid food, low acid ingredient.
Oh, really?
So water can change the formulation. Okay. So there are many bakery products. There are some, you can have some vegetables that you can acidify, and can be, from a pH of about 5.6, you can drop it to less than 4.6, and therefore you can cook it, put it in a jar or a can, whatever, and now it can be stored at room temperature. So the idea of this regulation is to have a shelf life and a storage and distribution at room temperatures, or ambient temperature, I would say.
Yeah. So Raphael brought up the example. I was thinking of pickles, right? So
pickles would be another one, right? Some of these pickles that you're going to be using, some vegetables that you will be using for pickling, they will have probably a pH about 4.6. Therefore, you're bringing it down. That would be an example. With fruits, it's different, because fruits many of them are naturally acid compounds, right? I mean, products. So you're dealing with products that are acid per se. Therefore, you don't need to acidify.
So like citrus fruits, like lemon or something like that.
Right. Even if you go into an extract or apple juice, the apple juice will be probably a low acid an acid product because it's going to be below 4.6. You still want to treat it with temperature because the extraction of apple brings a lot of microorganisms, right?
Yeah, there's lots of nice carbohydrates and other good stuff floating around.
That's correct. That's correct. And we also have some very tough environmental microorganisms that can survive a very low pH and multiply and use it, right? So
interesting. Yeah, I mean, so, and when you get into this area with the acidified foods and things like this is where a lot of home activities happen, right? So I can, picture my mom when I was a kid, taking the vegetables from the garden and canning them, right? Which you better make sure you know what you're doing, or you could have a risk there, right?
Correct. And that's where when I was working in universities and receiving some consumers, questions about canning and all of that, it was always interesting because sometimes I had to work with people that say, oh, I have a pressure cooker. Okay, let's work out a little bit of the pressure cooker, right? Because you're mimicking what is like a retort.
Yeah.
Right. But it has to be something that, can give us the temperature and the time that we're looking for. When it comes to, the other simple one, acidification, you have to tell people, you need to measure pH somehow. And it's not easy to do. Some of the paper strips that are used for pH can be used, but we don't really use it unless the pH of the finished product is below 4. Because anything above 4, you start having some variation. They're not that sensitive. So, I had to convince sometimes people to send a sample to a lab or, do some basic measuring of the pH.
Yeah, absolutely. So in my consulting business, so every now and then someone will contact me and say, hey, Bryan, I have my recipe from my mom's salsa or what have you that's amazing, and I want to start selling it and canning it. What do I need to do? And I'm always like, ooh, that's very, very tricky.
Yeah, there are some exemptions that are coming from the regulation, and the agency also have a little bit of leeway with that. Is, for instance, a tomato-based sauce. There is a large proportion of tomatoes were exempt. They were, although some of those tomatoes were getting to pH of 4.7, they said we will exempt and we will consider them like acid ingredient, So very interesting because nowadays all the companies that I work with that make tomato sauce, they receive tomatoes that are low pH, 4.1, 4.2, 4.3 at the most.
Huh. So kind of back to the definition side of things, so I can keep this kind of clear in my head. So if you have an acidified food, so you said it's below 4.6, was that correct?
Right. So there are, it's always a little bit tricky to explain. So let me see if I give it a shot. So when it comes to ingredients, there are acid ingredients and low acid ingredients. And the separation is a value of 4.6 in pH. Okay. So whenever an ingredient you test, like for instance, we were talking about some juices from fruits, if the pH is below 4.6, that's an acid ingredient. Okay. Some others, like meat, milk, they have pH of 6, so they are low acid ingredients. All right. But they can be food. An ingredient can be all food. Milk can be food. A juice can be the food, right? But there is also a third type of food that is the acidified food. That is a mix of low acid food ingredients, with either an acid or an acid ingredient to bring the low acid ingredient to below 4.6 in the finished product.
Driving it down.
So basically, there are evaluations that you do. That's what we do. We do evaluation by formulation, and based on the formulation, we put them in a category, and then based on that, you go through what would be the required thermal process. So if the ingredients, the low acid ingredients, are reduced in pH and the finished pH, that is called the equilibrium pH of the product, is below 4.6, that would be an acidified food.
Gotcha. Gotcha. And then, all these different parameters need to come together to, number one, eliminate the bacteria, or to your point earlier, prevent them from moving forward, right? So the spores can't germinate. Everybody's just kind of hanging out.
Correct. So the spores, in the case of acidified food, we know that there may be spores in there, but they are not gonna germinate. They're not gonna have any potential for public health. Yeah. We say 4.6. All the companies I work, I don't have anything about 4.4, 4.5, sometimes 4. When we start getting about 4.4, we all get a little bit antsy, because remember, the pH meters are not that exact. They have a variation, there's a plus minus when you measure with pH. Even the first, if you want to have extreme, very good sensitivity, you're going to pay a lot for that pH meter.
Yeah, exactly. And you don't want to be too close to that edge, because to your point, the variability. So
right.
If you're pasteurizing milk and the legal limit is 164F for 15 seconds, you're never going to run close to that, right? You're going to be 170, 175 to make sure that you never, ever go below that 164 line.
Correct. And then there is also it depends on the formulation, the type of ingredient. Some ingredients can have larger microbial loads, and then you say, well, there are potential for environmental microorganisms to come, and at higher pH, we know some of them can grow, like some bacilli at 4.1, 4.2 can start, growing. So it's a tough call at that point. So we always go for something more, in the safe side, but also for spoilage, preventing spoilage, right?
Yep, you have to be conservative. Let's see. So Insha in India, hi, welcome. Had a question for us here. What is the difference between canning and retorting?
Oh, very interesting. So when we call a canning, it's a process of placing the food within a container and then doing a treatment, okay? And traditionally it's associated with low acid food. And therefore, low acid food have been traditionally processed in retort. Retort is, for some of you may have the word autoclave, whatever. It's a pressure cooker. Yeah. It's a cooking process, a high pressure, where you can achieve high temperature and have more time and temperature to destroy the spores. Now, those low acid food can also be treated in aseptic systems. An aseptic system is a different one, because you first create a commercially sterile product by passing it through a tube where you have temperature, pressure, whatever you need to destroy, the microorganisms there. And then you have a package that you have kind of sterilized. The sterilization can be done by different means, by gas, and then you mix, and then you mix those two, a commercially sterile product with a sterile package in a sterile environment, and then you have a product that is commercially sterile. You didn't use pressure to treat the package. You use pressure and temperature to treat the product. That gives us the opportunity to use more flexible, packaging materials like pouches, some of the Tetra Pak systems that are more flexible. Some may not withstand the temperature and pressure in an autoclave. So that gives us the flexibility of having that.
Interesting. Yeah. So for example, the little coffee creamers I was talking about earlier, that was a sterile product. So we would make the material, sterilize that, and then it would go into the Bosch fillers, and you have the top layer and then the bottom layer, right? And it would vacuum form those in this sterile environment and fill the sterile product into the sterile cups, and boop, out it would go. And a lot of times in those processes, right, obviously with this, right, if you're doing ultra high temperature sterilization and these type of things, very expensive, very intensive process. And so associated with that then, Omar, is very long production runs, right? Because you want to run as long as you can keep that machine sterile. And so a lot of time those machines would run for a week or more. And so if you had a problem and something happened in the machine where sterility was broken and you didn't know it, you would have a whole lot of product that was at risk.
Yep. Yeah, yeah. And by the way, for instance, the way we in the case of the dairy product, especially fluid milk and things like that, we have very good refrigeration system in this country, but not all the country have that. So you go in some areas, and most of the time you just get milk that are like in Tetra Pak system long term, because they don't have a lot of refrigeration. The refrigeration system is limited, so it's like a premium.
A better way to do it. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So when you travel overseas, a lot of times we don't see those here in the U.S. very much. The Tetra Pak products. You see it like with the small ones that they have for children for milk for school,
right,
things like this. But that's generally about it. You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was very interesting on that side. And here's an interesting little thing for people listening to this that you may not know. And we used to get complaints on this, right? So people would open the little creamer to put in their coffee, and they would say, "Oh, it's curdled and it's bad. It must have bacteria in it." That wasn't bacteria. That was caused by the enzymes that were left behind by the bacteria that then went through and caused proteolytic reactions to break down the protein.
Yes. Well, in some of the pasteurization system, if you talk to experts in the dairy industry, they say, well, it's not only microorganisms. You have to destroy the enzymes, which is a different story, right?
Yep, all kinds of challenges, right? The world of bacteria are always finding new ways to mess with us.
Yeah.
So Bryan brought up that, remember, fermented foods, we were talking about fermented foods earlier, are exempt from, now he's referencing federal regulations here. So 21 CFR 113 and 114.
They are exempt, correct. The fermented food are exempt from this regulation. Also, those products where the safety comes from the low water activity. So anything that is a food with a water activity of 0.85 or below, they are exempt also.
Yeah. So that people are familiar with water activity. So water activity is a measure of the availability of water within a particular matrix for the bacteria, right? So the lower the number on that scale, the less water is available. So think things like honey, right? So for example, even though honey is a liquid, there's very, very little water that's available in that honey. So as a result, that honey can last for, and I think they've found, haven't they, Omar, honey in Egyptian tombs, right? And it'll last forever.
Yeah. It crystallizes a little bit if you let it go dry, right?
Because
the solid, whether they are sugar-based or salt, those ions, those solids are the one uptaking the water, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I think we answered Insh's question here between canning and retorting. What's interesting with retorting too is the technology in this area is amazing, right? So they're always coming up with new ways to do things. And as you mentioned, Omar, you have a autoclave, right, where you load racks of material in, you close it up, and then you bring it up to temperature and pressure for a certain time, and then you bring it back down because you don't want to explode the cans, and then you bring on your next batch, right? So everything in there is done by batch. But they also have continuous retorts too, which is absolutely amazing.
Yeah, there can be extremely like towers, like silos with chain system that goes and do passages for the treatment with pressure, without pressure. Yeah, it can be very complex and very expensive too.
Yeah, I think Campbell's soups. Yeah, I've never seen one, but I've understood too. It's like a giant spiral where the cans just continuously move, right? So then you're rotating the cans to maximize.
Correct. There are some with rotation within the can, some may be static. There are pros and cons. So when we do the training for the Better Process Control School, we go through that. We go through the different type of, retort systems. And now we have this year the Consumers Brands Association are kind of in charge of updating the book that we use for training. That book, actually, I have it right here, is called The Canned Food. It's a much thicker one in comparison with the previous version.
Oh, yeah.
The green one is the number 8, edition 8. This is edition 9. What I like with this latest edition is that it has a better definition of the type of certificate that people can get. Some just go for acidified food, so they don't need to go into details about retorts and pressure cookers. So they cover certain chapters. And then within the low acid food, there are kind of two tracks. I call it two tracks. One is for those that are using retorts and those that would be interested in aseptic systems.
Yeah,
and
right.
aseptic systems, I think, are becoming, from what I see, especially internationally, are becoming more and more accessible. All of these systems, retorts, aseptic, are quite expensive for the type of equipment that we use in the industry, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they're coming, I guess, a long way, and there's quite a bit of those systems, and they're very, very automated, almost bulletproof.
Interesting. Right. And then to your point earlier, we're seeing new ways of doing this as well. So pouches that are sterilized by pressure.
Exactly. Amazing that the material for packaging has evolved to levels that are amazing.
Yeah, I mean, because that was always a huge problem. So like in Costco, right, they have these packets of guacamole, which if you were to heat the guacamole, right, ruined. It would be, but you see these beautiful green packages with this guacamole in them. They do that with pressure.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah.
Raphael has an interesting point here. If you have honey to waste, take a spoiled food and put it in honey. You will see how the green or the blue dots disappear, right? The mold. You could even eat it, but do not do it. Honey may not touch all the product. Great bacteria killer. that sounds like fun. I want to do that. An interesting experiment. And so, I mean, that's part of it too. And I think this kind of brings on, so Raphael reminded me of a point here too, is a lot of the different matrices that are going into either low acid or LACF type products are not homogeneous, right? You have chunks of carrots and meat,
right,
or whatever right? So that modifies it too, right?
Right. So in the case of low acid food, really the pH is not a barrier for anything. So you don't care too much about the pH, right? But in a acidified food, the pH becomes a very important component on safety. It's an important critical factor that we call. So there is a term called the equilibrium pH. That is the pH of all the components in the formulation. And that means that the low acid food components should arrive to that, should achieve that, equilibrium pH, that is the one that you will measure. That can happen almost as you mix it. If you are, imagine you have a commercial, kettle with a mixing system, it can be right there within minutes of adding all the ingredients, or it may happen after you process and package within certain number of hours. So in most of these cases, the equilibrium pH is very important, and you measure usually after 24 hours. In some cases, when you have solids, and if the solid is a low acid food ingredient, you have to really measure that well to ensure that, again, all the particles, all the components of the product achieve that equilibrium pH.
Yeah, because I mean, the pH is really important, and then the heat penetration as well. Because if you have that can in a retort, the heat is going to move faster through certain media versus others, right? So it's going to get through the liquid quickly.
Correct. As we said, for the low acid food, we don't care too much about the pH, low acid, because it's about 4.6, right? But then you go into all these details about heat distribution, size of particles, exactly. All these things that we do just to collect what would be the worst case scenario, what would be the coldest spot in a can or within a package, and then within a system, whether it's a retort, right? And then with those, you go and then you calculate, the thermal process that you want to apply. That will be a time of pressure and temperature for a retort, or the time that you have the product in the holding tube in the case of an aseptic system. Right. So that's exactly that. All of that it's not that relevant for an acidified food because you are really cooking them. You have the freedom to cook it in atmospheric, pressure all the time you want. So as long as you cook it, that's more the I would say a quality issue of the cooking. You can cook them at high temperatures. Remember, the thicker they become, the higher you can go. If water boils at 100 degrees Celsius, about 212, 215, you can cook them at that temperature sometimes. Some soups, some sauces I've seen there cook at high temperature, boiling. And it's mainly for spoilage. To prevent any spoilage. Yeah. You're destroying everything when it comes to public health in there. All the vegetative cells are way dead after you start going about 160, 71 degrees Celsius, 160 Fahrenheit. They start dying quickly.
Yeah. And even, so we would have to have these calculations for the fluid products that we were doing this with for sterilization, is how that liquid is even flowing through the process, right? So is it a laminar or a tubular? What is your flow doing within there, right? Are you getting good mixing, or is it just going through that?
Correct. Yeah, again, so all of that for aseptic system and food that are going to be treated in retort, low acid food, temperature profile, all of that is critical. Yeah, it's very critical. The other, again, we're talking about atmospheric systems. You have more variation. There are variation in formulation, but they are not that complicated. The complications there is usually the distribution of the acid. You have some product that then don't uptake the acid well, so that equilibrium pH can be a moving target for many hours, days, sometimes.
Well, yeah. To your point, yeah, it can adjust afterwards, and you don't know about it.
Yeah, exactly. So you really need to understand that part of the formulation well, to make sure that you get the right equilibrium pH and don't ship that product before.
The bottom line here, Omar, is if you're producing products in these two areas, you have to know what you're doing.
Yeah, right, exactly. And there is that training, and by the regulation require that at least somebody trained in the better processes school. The regulation says in a training curriculum that has been kind of approved or accepted by the FDA commissioner. And
so
of course,
yeah.
So when you open up this book, you're gonna have the letters of the FDA representative and also USDA, because USDA also have similar regulation for canned food. So this, like I am a lead instructor and I can do instruction here. My name is is within the FDA, the low acid canned food groups. They know that I am there. I have been vetted before as an instructor.
So. Right. Well, and then there's also the concept of a process authority, right? Well, can you kind of explain that?
Right. The process authority comes from really your experience working with some foods. Mm-hmm. There is not really one place or one straight direct way to do it or get it. The term processing authority comes from these regulations, and it has been kind of abused over the time. They sometimes call it process authority. The original word is processing. It doesn't matter. But some people, for instance, at the state level, they can say, Omar is trying to do a new product, and they are not very familiar. And it happens that they know Bryan. I say, Omar, talk to Bryan because he will do an evaluation. He's a processing authority, okay? Mm-hmm. And it may be an evaluation not related to low acid food or acidified food. But in the case, they can do an evaluation for, fermented food. Okay, they may say, I am not sure if the fermentation is right. So, okay, they get somebody that has that expertise. So that, as you can see, is a very generic term. The only the only association that I am aware of that have like an archival of people that are considered processing authority is AFDO.
I'm not familiar with them.
Yeah, the AFDO. You can send your references, your credentials, and they are the one that are gonna be putting you, like my name appears in a website. AFDO is the one behind the certification that is giving for food safety training. Like for instance, all the seafood hazard come from AFDO. At the end of the day, when you are doing training with preventive controls, there is somebody from AFDO signing also the certificate. So they are the one archiving all of that. And AFDO has been since the 1800s, one of the oldest trade association within food. The Association for Food and Drug Officials, AFDO.
Gotcha. So shorthand language for this would be an expert, right? An expert in a particular area.
You show the expertise, and exactly. And then also becomes, when the industry call me, it's just not that they found my name there and they're gonna trust me right away. They say, look, we work with this group, this company, and they have worked with you, and they told me that you can do this. And if not, do you know who can do that? So we are kind of a smaller group, and sometimes we may share a little bit things, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, you want the right person, because you have to file this then too, right? Your process.
Right. So there is a filing process, and if you don't mind showing again I can quickly show this, because just to show something different. There is a process in here. You can see that this where right here, when you send a submission from a food canning establishment, FDA will give you an FCE, food canning establishment number. With that's associated to that particular food facility. So you have a food facility registration, an FCE number, and then every time you do a process filing, in this case, I use the example of acidified food, the process filing will have an FCE and what will be creating in the moment that you send it, that this is submission identifier, or SID. So those two things, the FCE number and the SID, are important to trace back those particular filing. So when I do filing for instance, on behalf of a company, I receive an email created automatically saying, we have received the filing, but then they can come back and say, well, we have questions about the filing. And that filing, when I refers to them, we're going to be referring based on the FCE and the SID number.
Right. And so essentially then, once this has been approved and say, yes, this process is effective and it's going to control what we want to control, you have to follow that. And if you deviate, so let's say, for example, something happens in the process, you have a power outage for a little bit, and the temperature comes down a little bit. It didn't follow the filing. What happens then?
So basically, that's how you tackle. Also, remember, all of these processing, facilities, manufacturing facilities are under FISMA too, right? Because GMPs coming 21 CFRs 117 subpart B apply, but then apply subpart C, having a food safety plan. And therefore, there you address them. There are different ways to address them, but you have to start corrective action. If you have to have critical factors that you measure in order to prove that safety. In the low acid food, there might be all those critical factors related to the thermal process itself. In the acidified food, it will be not only thermal process, but also the equilibrium pH. Okay, and maybe temperature of the product going into the packaging, because you are trying to ensure that if there is any residual cells in the package, you are kind of destroying them too, right? So it may be different, but those critical factors can be addressed through your food safety plan. So you have a deviation, your pH is not 4.1, it's 4.3. Yeah, you have to do something. You have to do a corrective action.
Right. And then in those type of situations, I would approach you as my process authority and say, hey, Omar, we had
What
an
do we
issue
do?
during production. Can you take a look at this data and see if it's still safe?
Correct, and that's when, for the companies where I do a little bit of filing. Sometimes I also play the role of a processing authority, and evaluate those deviations. Exactly. Yeah.
Very cool.
By the way, the FDA will communicate with you after they evaluate your filing, and they say at this time we don't have any other questions. So basically, they are saying we're okay with it. They never say, here it is, it's approved, it's guaranteed now. It's not going to
No.
come from the agency.
Yeah. So what do they call it? They call it a notice of what is it?
The non-compliance I'm talking about?
Well, no. So they'll never say, yes, we approve, but they will say, no, we have no objection, right?
Exactly. The notice of, that's when you, exactly. And here is something like that. We are okay. We don't have any further questions.
And so as luck would have it, right? So as you guys can tell, and this is kind of time to bring this back up to the 30,000 foot level, is acidified foods and low acid canned foods exceptionally complex, right? And these regulations predate FSMA, and you can kind of see now how all these things are kind of working together too, and why when FSMA was created and the regulations were written, why certain existing structures were exempted, because the rigor was already there within them.
Correct. And if basically, I always say that if we're talking about risk-based process, because food safety is based on practices, right?
Mm-hmm.
Food manufacturing practices. This regulation with acidified food, the low acid food that came first, is one of the first one that has a comprehensive approach to manufacturing that is based on risk. It's how to prevent, public health problem from appearing in food, really.
Absolutely. And in the month of November, as luck would have it, so you are teaching a couple courses on this at EAS. So let's see, I believe in early November. So, so there's several days that are taking place. There's the Acidified Foods course, and then there's the LACF course as well. It looks like a 3-day course for that as well. So lots of work to do there. So if you produce products in this area, and you'd like to take those courses from Omar, as you can tell, right? He's going to be a good teacher. He does such a good job of explaining these concepts. I put the link in here to those courses, so definitely go and check those out.
Thank you, Bryan. Yeah.
Oh, you're welcome. And Renee, my assistant here, also stuck in here the new group we put together on Locals, which is really cool. So Locals is a platform for sharing information, and you can set that up, and it's free. So you can go to this link and sign up for that. And I put postings in there for recalls. If there's things that are going on the news, I put those in there. If there's special little videos or lessons I'm doing at the membership level, I have those in there as well too. So if you want to continue learning about food safety and broaden your horizon in those other areas as well, please consider joining the Locals group. It's really pretty cool.
Great.
So in closing, Omar, any final thoughts you'd like to share with everybody, or?
No, not too much. I just want to thank you for what you do, Bryan. It's amazing what you're doing. The energy that you put in it is very contagious, and it's always welcome, because the area of food safety is still a very dry area. Mm-hmm. Sometimes people don't understand it well. It's not very enticing, and I think you are changing a little bit that, and I appreciate for that.
Yeah. One of the things, there's two things I would always tell my quality managers when I worked in companies, is that we do what we do because we care, right? There's easier ways to make money than what we do, but we're technical people, and we're taking this information and using it to protect public health, which is a huge calling, right? Very, very important. And to your other point, Omar, the unfortunate side of what we do is if we do it well, nobody notices, because everything goes fine, right?
You are touching something like, exactly right. It's not concrete. It doesn't bring you a reward. It just you are just manufacturing more.
Exactly. So once again, this show doesn't happen, and the enjoyment and enthusiasm we get this are for the participation. So thank you everybody for joining us. Mohammed in Iran, thank you for joining us. A lot of people don't know, a lot of food comes from that area of the world that we enjoy, pistachios, right? So
Yes,
Persian
exactly.
pistachios, one of the
Yes.
largest producers in the
The
world.
largest producer, right?
And so Bryan Ravitch, lots of good comments here. Thank you, Bryan. Bryan used to work for FDA, and he's a big authority in these areas. And we've been working out a time to get Bryan on here. So hopefully here pretty soon we'll have Bryan on the show too. But he's pointing out here that per preventive control hazards, control through 113, don't need to be identified in hazard analysis, right? That can be confusing. Absolutely. So thank you, Bryan. We appreciate your comments. So time flies, right? On these shows, it's always amazing, Omar, how quickly this goes. And next Friday, the 22nd of October, of course, we will be back. And we're actually creeping up here, Omar, on our first year anniversary. I've been doing this now for almost a year.
Wow.
Can you believe it?
A year. Congratulations.
It's crazy. So join us, please, here next Friday at 10 a.m. Eastern, 8 a.m. Mountain. And again, we're on YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter. And my assistant who's in here too, Renee Oboza, O-B-O-Z-A, and I'm sorry, Renee, if I mispronounced your last name. He puts together an event page every week, and you can go to his profile, become friends with him on LinkedIn, and then you can sign up for the event, and then that way you'll get notifications that the next one is coming up, because sometimes it's easy to miss this. But we're glad everybody was able to join us today. Enjoy the fall. Enjoy this wonderful weather. I know I am going to get out and do some things, so I hope you are able to as well, Omar.
Yes, for sure. Thanks again for the invitation, and have a nice weekend.
Absolutely. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next week.